Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this Microfocus COBOL webinar. My name is Ed Airey. I am your host for today's session. Today's webinar will be a closer look at modern COBOL development. And more specifically, I'll look at the recent Microfocus book that was published last June, titled Visual COBOL, A Developer's Guide to Modern COBOL. This will be a discussion with Paul Kelly, the author, as well as product management, Scot Nielsen. As I said, my name is Ed Airey. I'm the product marketing director for our COBOL solutions here at Microfocus. And you can see I'm part of a much larger team here at Microfocus supporting the COBOL and mainframe solutions. As I mentioned, I'm joined with my colleague, Scot Nielsen. I'd like to turn things over to Scot here for just a moment for a brief introduction and a few opening words. Scot?
Thank you, Ed, and hello and welcome once again to the webinar, everyone. My name is Scot Nielsen. As Ed mentioned, I'm the product manager for our COBOL solution here at Microfocus, part of the team that you see on the slide here. But specifically, I look after and help manage the products that support customers running applications, COBOL applications on distributed platforms, so Windows, Unix, and Linux, and work alongside my colleagues who help organizations with applications on the mainframe as well. So a lot of synergy there across both those solution areas. So looking forward to talking to you today about the book alongside Paul Kelly.
Scot, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, we have our special guest, Mr. Paul Kelly. Paul is the author of the book that we mentioned, and he'll be adding his insights and, of course, background into putting that material together. Paul, I'd like to turn things over to you for just a moment for an introduction and a few opening words, please.
Thanks, Ed. Well, it's really nice to be asked to do this today. Makes a real change from my day job. I've been at Microfocus for a long time, and I was involved in Visual COBOL in its very early days, so starting around 2002, 2003. More recently, I've been involved in web and cloud, but I helped out write this book a couple of years ago, and it was published last year, and it was a very interesting exercise, and I'm kind of delighted to have the chance to talk about it. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you, Scot, for those introductions. So here is our plan for today's conversation. We'll start with a bit of background. We'll take a closer look at the, again, continued importance of COBOL within our everyday lives and supporting core business systems. We'll then jump into the interview. We'll talk a little bit about many topics that touch on the book. And then, of course, we'll cover some of the resources that are available for developers as we conclude our webinar. Now, throughout today's broadcast, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions using the GoToWebinar chat function. Many of you have pre-submitted a question during the registration process, so thank you for that. We have your questions in front of us, and we'll be posing those to Scot and Paul during today's broadcast. But if you have a question during the live session, please feel free to submit it, and we will take that question towards the end of the broadcast as time allows. So let's jump into today's material. And let's start with just a quick reminder of the importance that COBOL plays in our everyday lives. Again, we continue to see COBOL systems supporting the majority of core business applications, whether it be government organizations, finance, manufacturing, insurance. Over 70% of business transactions today are underpinned by COBOL applications. This is further emphasized by the number of Microfocus COBOL customers that continue to use this technology to support business critical systems. And we've learned as a result of the recent COBOL survey that over 85% of these applications are deemed strategic to the business, which effectively means that these applications are here to stay, at least for the next decade, perhaps even longer. A large reason for this is not only the continued importance of these applications, but the complexity and, of course, the scale that these applications have within our environments here today. Again, whether you're a manufacturing organization, whether you're a government services agency, whether banking and finance, these applications range in size and scale, but their importance to the business remains. And what was very clear as a result of the survey and the research that we saw is that these applications are moving forward. In fact, nearly 60% of these applications will be modernized in the next 2 years. And these are just a few of the priorities, the ways in which customers plan to modernize their systems. As you can see here at the very top, Java and .NET integration is the #1 priority. That's very fitting because that will be part of the discussion here today with Scott and with Paul. But there are other priorities as well. As you can see, integration with modern development tools and practices, moving to the cloud, and of course, integration with relational database management platforms. So we'll try to touch on a variety of these things, of course, with focus on Java and .NET. But for these reasons, and for many more, the feedback that we've received from our customers, we decided to bring this book to market, a new developer resource, with focus on helping you bridge the two worlds together, be able to bridge COBOL systems to the world of Java and .NET. The book provides a variety of different resources, a number of code samples and references for you as a developer to learn modern COBOL development, but also put it into practice. Our conversation today, though, will be a closer look at some of the detail within the book. Perhaps you've had an opportunity to read it, review it, or perhaps this is new news and you'd like to learn a little bit more about this resource. Well, that's our goal here today. And to jump into today's discussion, what I'd like to do is bring Paul and Scott into the discussion here, into the interview. And I'd like to start with a question for you, Paul, if you don't mind, to get things started, to give us a bit of background. Could you explain a little bit about what this book is all about? Give us some background, please.
Okay, so we've been working on Visual COBOL for, say, well over 10 years now, starting in 2002. And effectively, it extends the COBOL language with a lot of new features for object orientation, but also it means that COBOL code can run on .NET or JVM platforms. So it kind of extends the platform reach of COBOL. And what we wanted to do was really explain the new language, show the features in it. And it's a very hands-on book, so there's lots of examples for you to work through. So it tries to be kind of very practical in terms of here's some code, here's how you get it to run, and this is what it does.
That's great, Paul. Could you talk a little bit then about who the target audience is for this book?
Well, we had really kind of a couple of audiences in mind. Obviously, we would hope that a lot of existing COBOL developers will pick this book up and read it and learn about how Visual COBOL extends the reach of COBOL into, say, these new platforms, these new areas, and makes it much easier to modernize those strategic applications you talked about earlier. But also, it's aimed partly at Java or C# programmers who are working on an application modernization and would like to have some kind of understanding of what it is they're connecting to on the back end. So it does spend a little time explaining, if you like, procedural COBOL and what those data structures look like and what it is that you're trying to achieve. So, there's something here for everyone, I think.
Well, that's great to hear. So you'd say then equally perhaps that the book is applicable for modern developers, modern Java, .NET developers, as well as COBOL developers?
I think so, yes.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the rationale and the reasoning behind bringing this book to market. Scott, I'd like to bring you into the discussion here, please. From a Microfocus strategy and certainly product management perspective, what was the view in terms of publishing this book, and why is it important that it be delivered today? Why now?
Okay, yes, good question. And I think there's an awful lot of reasons that we might call out around the rationale for publishing the book and investing in all that time and all of Paul's time to produce it. But I think principally it goes back to some unique capabilities that were introduced with the advent of Visual COBOL, that product itself, and those capabilities we've really seen adopted by many of our customers to do some really great things with their applications and really modernize them in new ways. And the capabilities I'm referring to, Paul touched on them already, of course, but it's the ability for a COBOL program to run inside of either the .NET framework or the common language runtime, more precisely, or inside of the Java virtual machine. And there's a couple of facets to that. One is that there's a range of extensions available that we've made available in the COBOL language, so that COBOL developers themselves can access the features of the .NET framework directly from COBOL. So there's a lot of object-oriented extensions. We'll come on and talk about that more, I'm sure. But as importantly as sort of writing new code, which is a lot about what the book will be focusing on, really, it makes it possible for existing procedural COBOL applications as they stand today, in many respects, especially when we're talking about ANSI standard COBOL, for that to be compiled directly to Java bytecode or directly to Microsoft intermediate language to run in the .NET CLR. And that really opens up a wide range of modernization options, as I mentioned earlier, that our customers are taking advantage of. So to help them better deliver on those requirements that they have, this book makes complete sense and enables the COBOL developer to take advantage of the .NET framework or Java SDK in new ways and understand that better. And it also, as Paul was just saying, allows Java and .NET developers actually to get involved in that space as well.
Thank you, Scott. So from what I'm hearing here, it sounds like it's definitely a theme from the conversations you've had with your customers and how they're plan to deploy their COBOL applications into the future. Modernization is at the forefront of their planning.
Yes, absolutely, very much so. And going back to your earlier slides about the strategy for these applications and their longevity, you talked about them being around for the next 10 years and very likely longer. Well, actually, if we look back, those applications have been around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years already in some cases. And this, these applications need to go through a regular cycle of modernization or continuous modernization to keep at the forefront of IT delivery and the business needs. And we're trying to make that possible here today to get even more value from these applications. They contain a lot of value, and whether people realize it or not, many of us interact with a COBOL system at least once, but possibly several times a day, without necessarily realizing that's what's going on. Those applications are at the heart of many organizations, and being able to reuse that existing proven value in new ways to support a new user experience, maybe on a mobile device, or to make the business logic accessible as some kind of service, that's very much the current modernization theme that we're seeing. So yes, absolutely, modernization is a theme running throughout this.
Thank you, Scott. Very good. I think that's an excellent segue here to sort of the next topic we'd like to cover, which is platforms and the continued interest we see from COBOL customers to deploy those systems on new environments, whether it be Windows, Unix, Linux, but also now more modern environments, managed code, as you mentioned a moment ago, and even the cloud. So, Paul, maybe to start with you, if I could, please. The book covers the topics of native and managed code. Could you give a bit of definition and background, please, as to what do we mean by those terms?
Okay, so native code is machine code effectively. So you take your COBOL program and you compile it, and on Windows you end up with a .exe or .dll, and that's actual native machine code that runs directly on your chip, the CPU of your computer. Now the .NET CLR and the JVM platforms, those runtimes, they actually run an intermediate language, kind of bytecode, the two platforms. But when we talk about managed code, we're really talking about code that's compiled for either JVM or the .NET CLR. And that code is sort of picked up at runtime by those platforms and actually just in time compiled down to native code. What those platforms also do is they provide a lot of extra features that are not available to something running as native code. So they provide automatic memory management and lots of kind of runtime facilities around things like attributes and reflection and that sort of thing. So you get a lot of benefit from being on a managed platform. One of the things it enables us to do is to offer all the object-oriented features that are in Visual COBOL. So that's kind of in a nutshell, really, the difference between native and managed code.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. I think you touched on it there a little bit towards the end. I'd like to explore that a little bit further if we could. So given that there's been a focus on managed code, why does that matter? And particularly in the context of those that have built COBOL applications. If you could start, Paul, please.
Well, managed code matters because it's really, if you like, it's the way a lot of platforms now are going for running applications. So the biggest platform these days for almost any application is in fact the web and web servers. And that's whether it's actually a REST service that, provides kind of plumbing and functionality to some other piece of code, or it's actually a web page that a human interacts with. More and more of our applications are one way or another ending up as something that we serve up over the internet. And the way to do that these days, really, the easiest way to do that is managed code, because you're running either C#, .NET code on Microsoft's IIS, or you're running Java bytecode on, one of the many Java application servers that, go all the way from Tomcat to IBM's WebSphere. So managed code really matters if you want to be playing in that space, if you want to be running your applications on that platform.
Thank you, Paul. So maybe carrying on from this conversation here of platforms, Scott, if I can bring you into the discussion a bit, looking at this from a COBOL perspective, of course, do we consider COBOL to be a cross-platform language, particularly given some of the things Paul has mentioned?
Well, indeed we do. In fact, it's one of its most important attributes, I would say. If we look back, and we can put our finger on one thing in particular that has led to the success of COBOL, over decades, arguably, one of the most successful languages ever. One of the reasons that we still see organizations using this language today, and more importantly, the applications that have been created in COBOL, is that it is possible to move them from one platform to another. And that is a continuing state within IT. The platforms or the hardware changes. Today's Intel is obviously a very important platform, not the only one, of course, as there are others. But if you're looking back in time, there have been other chipsets that have come and gone. Likewise with operating systems too. Many have appeared over the course of the last few decades and have gone away to be replaced by new operating systems. Every time something like that happens, it's the potential for the software that you've written to become obsolete just because the underlying platform has changed, and you don't necessarily have a way to run what you've previously created on a new system. Now, COBOL has been able to deal with that by really having portability built into it from day one. And certainly what we do at Microfocus is spend a lot of time making sure COBOL is portable and between different platforms, and so that you can get the same behavior you do today on a new platform you might be taking it to. And so, going back to our conversation today, the managed code platforms of Java and JVM and .NET, they are just effectively new platforms where people are deploying code today. So what we're trying to do is make it possible for you to reuse that existing COBOL value inside of those new platforms. So you don't have to rewrite, you don't have to start again. You really reuse what you've already created, but within the context of Java or .NET.
Thank you, Scott. So, I mean, would it be fair to say that if an organization had a need to deploy to multiple platforms, particularly given the book is focused on Java and .NET or JVM and .NET, that is very feasible from a COBOL perspective, being able to deploy to both?
Yes, it is. Well, I mean, even outside of the managed code conversation, that is what, in fact, many organizations do, especially, a lot of our ISVs who, again, it may not be something that many people are aware of, but there's many COBOL applications out there in the market that people use, may not realize they're written in COBOL. And one of the benefits of this portability is that an independent software vendor can create an application in COBOL without having to limit it to a particular platform, without having to force their customer to choose and to be on a certain platform. They can make it available across a wide range of platforms and still offer that core functionality. And so that's, in our native code world, in managed code as well. And Paul, I'm sure we'll have some details to share with you here about other features that we offer. But the COBOL is going to be one of the few languages where actually you can compile procedural COBOL code and object-oriented COBOL code and run exactly the same code in the Java virtual machine, or recompile it with no change and run it on the .NET platform too. So it really is a cross-platform language, and we go to great efforts to ensure that that's possible. So Paul, maybe you could touch on some of the sort of the class libraries and the language extensions that we've added to make that possible.
So there's kind of one of the things with JVM and .NET is that as well as being different runtimes, they both have different frameworks or sets of libraries that provide all kinds of things, from the way you handle collections or files, or even things like strings. And so having a language that compiles on both platforms is only part of the answer to being able to write cross-platform code that will run on either JVM or .NET. So in Visual COBOL, we've kind of put in some extensions that effectively mean that we can share some data types between those two languages. So we have an equivalent to a dictionary that works on JVM or .NET exactly the same, and the collection classes, and also strings, and that really does lower the barrier to writing code that you can, object-oriented code that you can actually recompile and have run on either platform. So all the examples in the book have actually been written as cross-platform examples. There's one set of downloads where you're running, the examples on, through Visual Studio or Eclipse, on .NET or JVM. And the book tells you how, it kind of goes through strategy, because there are always going to be some little bits that are going to be specific to your JVM or CLR platform. So we kind of show you the strategies where you can isolate those and actually keep all your business logic, all the important code, neutral. And so there's only a very kind of small stub at the back somewhere that might be different between the two platforms. So yes, COBOL, it really is the cross-platform language almost.
That's great, Paul, and thank you, Scott. Great insights there. So let's carry on that discussion, talk a little bit more about how COBOL is a cross-platform language, and look at some of those new platforms that it now supports, specifically .NET and JVM. So maybe first question for you, Scott and Paul, I think you have some views here on this as well. Why is Microfocus positioning COBOL in this way, particularly alongside .NET and Java? Does it go back to some of the points you were making earlier, particularly around the needs we're seeing within the customer base, or where the market's moving? Could you share your thoughts, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be brief, because I think we did actually touch on a lot of these points already. But if an organization is building new IT, new software services today, it's very likely that they'll start to build those for a managed code platform of some variety, whether it's .NET or Java. And if you look at the kind of applications they might be building, whether it's apps or whatever it might be, we want to make it possible for them to reuse the core business logic that they have available in the COBOL applications themselves. It's very likely, let's say, for example, you're building a mobile application, you need to access core business logic back on a server somewhere, or maybe it's a web page, as Paul was talking about earlier on. That core functionality is going to be provided by the existing COBOL applications. So as they're building out new services, having COBOL applications there natively on the same platform that application is running on, so in Java or .NET, that makes that logic so much more accessible and so much more reusable for that purpose. So I won't go much further, because I think we talked about that a lot.
Very good. Thank you, Scott. Well, continuing on here, Paul, a question for you then. Would this be of any use in your mind, to a Java or .NET developer?
Well, I think it would, because again, if you're a Java or .NET developer and you've been, your task is to help modernize one of these applications, I think it's very helpful for you if you, one, have some understanding of, what it is you're connecting to and using, but also the fact that that thing can actually be recompiled and made callable directly from Java or .NET. yeah, that makes your life easier and everyone's life easier, I think.
Very good, thank you. So could we talk a little bit about the aspect here of, or maybe perception that .NET is really about Microsoft languages, particularly, C#, Visual Basic. Does COBOL really have a role here in the context of .NET? What are your thoughts there, Paul?
Well, Microsoft always intended the .NET, the CLR, I mean, it's called the Common Language Runtime, and they really always intended that to be a kind of open runtime that other people could develop languages for. So although Microsoft obviously have developed, most languages for their own platform, and some of the best known ones, Microfocus isn't the only vendor to have put a language on the .NET CLR. And in fact, similarly with JVM, lots of new languages now are being developed that run on the JVM. So we've got Kotlin and Scala and I think Haskell as well, all run on the JVM backend. So both these managed platforms have been used really as a basis to develop new languages. So no, I don't think they are just about Microsoft languages, or in the case of JVM, just about Java.
No, indeed. They're kind of platforms in their own right for agnostic for many other languages. And perhaps I'll just add to Paul's words. We're talking about the deployment environment, the runtime environment here, Java and .NET. But let's not overlook the development tools themselves. So Visual Studio and Eclipse. They themselves are platforms for development tools and supporting many languages. I mean, I've lost count of the number of programming languages that you can use Visual Studio with today. And similarly, the Eclipse IDE, which was predominantly designed for Java developers, has access now for many other languages, and of course, including COBOL as well. So these vendors recognize that the secret to success is really opening up, to support a much wider ecosystem.
Thank you, Scott. Could we maybe talk a little bit about that ecosystem for a moment? I'd imagine that, particularly given this level of maturity with the technology to call COBOL a modern development language, we probably worked quite a while with Microsoft and other organizations to bring that to market to mature the capability.
Well, yes, you'd be right. I think Paul may have mentioned earlier on, we actually started out creating the predecessor to Visual COBOL, almost back in 2002 or something, I think it was, and that was really our first R&D project to be able to take COBOL, procedural COBOL, into a managed code environment. At the time, it was .NET. And as we started to see the interest from our customers in that, obviously we invested further, adding more investment around the IDEs themselves, and so we've been, making it possible to edit, compile, debug COBOL code inside of Visual Studio now for, had a product around in that area for well over a decade. A little bit more recently, but still around for many years now. Also the same is now true for Eclipse. So developers can use Eclipse or Visual Studio to edit and debug COBOL applications. And that brings in an interesting dynamic for developers in the sense that we've got COBOL and Java or .NET developers now all working in more or less the same tools. And so the exposure to COBOL, the exposure to Java and .NET, there's a lot of crossover between those development teams now. And COBOL itself becomes, again, much more accessible to a new generation of developers. And so seeing lots of good things now that Java or .NET developers can actually see and work with COBOL in their native development tool environment. It makes it much more accessible.
That's great, Scott. And I think you touched on a topic here that we want to move to right now, which is a closer look at those developers, whether it be .NET or Java, COBOL developers. We look at the first question here, how effectively are existing Microfocus customers using that technology today? Does it vary, I guess, by organization to organization?
Yeah, well, maybe we should just look at that from the what's driving people towards deploying applications, COBOL applications in these managed code platforms. I've talked about the development tools just previously, lots of good reasons for adopting those to standardize on your development teams, tool sets, to make it possible to bring new generation of developers into COBOL. So we kind of dealt with that, but let's look at actually deploying applications into the managed code platforms. What's driving that? There's a few reasons. One of which could be as simple as that the strategy, for the IT department, maybe as set by the CIO or somebody, is that we are a .NET shop or we are a Java shop. And that will sort of cascade through the organization, and that may pull through the COBOL applications, that because now it's possible to do that, COBOL can run in Java or .NET and sort of support that strategy. But that's good, and it's useful that we can do that. But there's a lot more exciting things going on as well, in the sense that now you're there, you can take advantage of these platforms and modernize the application. That modernization is either Java or .NET developers now being able to access the functionality within COBOL much more easily and present that in new ways to provide new user experiences. So Java developers using their skills to enhance the user experience in some way. Or equally, now that COBOL developers can play in this environment, they too can start to access the same things that Java and .NET developers have available to them. And one of my favorite demos to sort of set the scene here and highlight the things that are available to a COBOL developer is to show a small scope code snippet in COBOL code, which is taking advantage of the .NET framework, for example. And my favorite demo is around date time arithmetic, because in just a couple of lines of code, you can do some very complex calculations involving a date or a time that otherwise, outside of that platform, require hundreds, if not more, lines of code to do similar tasks that many organizations have developed over years. So the fact that you can kind of dispose a lot of that and rely on the inherent capabilities of the framework, so I think sets people's minds alight about what's possible when you're working on these platforms.
That's great, Scott. That's great, Ed. Maybe just a follow-on quick question then, based on those discussions that you've had with customers, and that the product, the technology's been around for at least 10 years, a little bit longer now. Does it vary depending on where customers are along their journey? I mean, are some still in the exploratory phase, are others heavily integrating their COBOL systems with .NET and Java? I mean, are there particular signs and signals you see?
Yes, of course. I mean, everyone's at a different stage. Maybe a lot of that is just to do with the organization's current view of the COBOL application and their strategy, and whether that strategy is to remain with the COBOL application. A lot of organizations are trying to weigh up what the right next step is. Of course, today's session is all about opening people's eyes to the possibilities. And what I would say is that actually, what might be something that takes a long time to figure out what your future would be. Actually, when you put this kind of capability in front of a .NET or Java developer, the progress that they can make, given what's available to them at this point, it can be very rapid indeed. And the transformations and the modernization that we see, for all the talk that happened beforehand about what the future should be, should it be a rewrite in a new language, or should we buy a package, that all is long in the past. There's a distant memory, and the way forward is very clear, because reusing all that valuable business logic makes so much sense at that point. People can really see it, and they've got their hands on something that's new, looks modern, vibrant, and of course it's all built on tried, tested, core business functionality.
Scott, thank you. So let's explore then. I mean, this sounds all very exciting, and being able to leverage this modern COBOL development technology, whether your background be in COBOL or with .NET or Java tools. Paul, can you speak to this from a perspective of the software? I assume the book provides a lot of samples, as you've mentioned. Does it provide any software, and how would the developer get access to that?
Well, the book does come with a lot of examples, and certainly all the larger pieces of code in there, all the main works examples in this tutorial section of the book are available for download from the microfocus.com website. They're all free, as is the book. And obviously you also need some Microfocus software to actually be able to compile and run the examples. So obviously we have our commercially licensed products, but we also have a free product, which I think Scott might want to talk about.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yes, just very quickly, absolutely, Paul. Visual COBOL Personal Edition is available, which is a more or less identical to the commercial version we provide. It has somewhat limited features in some places, but generally speaking, does everything else that the commercial version does. More importantly, you can use it free of charge to run through the samples that Paul's talking about that are available in the book. So I think Ed, I'm sure we'll have a link to that later on. But please, if you're interested in learning about COBOL, you're not a COBOL developer yet, or you can still get access to these tools free of charge in a non-commercial setting. So perfect for learning and going through this book very quickly from our website. So Ed, I'm sure you've got a link coming on where to obtain that just shortly.
Yes, we do. Of course, we'll share all those links with the audience here very shortly. Scott, just to follow one quick question about the software. I mean, I imagine folks may want to go through the book and material at their own pace. Are there any restrictions on the software? I mean, how long is the software available to them should they wish to download it? Any guidance there?
Yeah, so the software we're talking about here is Visual COBOL Personal Edition. So you get a year-long license, annual license, 365 days, which you can renew the following year simply by registering once again. So you can get your hands on that very quickly just by filling out a short form on microfocus.com, and then you'll get access to the software. And off you go.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, it sounds very simple in terms of getting started. So Scott and Paul, thank you very much for a quick look at behind the scenes, if you will, of some of the detail within the book. Maybe just a closing question here for you, Paul, before we jump into some of the pre-submitted questions. There's a lot in that book. I think over 370 pages of technical content, and you've referenced some of the samples as well. So I think the question may be, well, what's ahead? What's next for you, Paul?
Well, I have recently started work on a second book, which is very much a follow-up in that we're not going to be covering the same material again. And this book is going to be focused this time just on JVM. And we're really looking at, some of those modernization scenarios. So, running COBOL inside a container, running it in an application server, connecting it over a message bus like ActiveMQ, all those kinds of things, kind of, again, practical things, techniques, strategies for connecting your COBOL code and really modernizing those existing applications. So we're really carrying on with that theme, but I say the new book, rather than talking so much about the language, is really looking more about, if you like, the platforms and the technologies and the ways we can use it.
Very good, very exciting. Is it planned for a specific audience, Paul? I mean, you mentioned JVM. Is it for Java developers, or is who you're targeting?
I'd say we're targeting probably primarily Java developers, but also, again, COBOL developers. Anyone who's got one of these apps that they want to modernize, they need to bring forward, should find a lot of interesting stuff in this book. And really, we're not so much presenting, if you like, canned solutions. This is the way you should do it. We're more really presenting a kind of a menu of options and things that you want to try, because every application is different. What works for one application may not be appropriate for another. But we're talking about really ways you can scale applications out and all those kinds of things.
It's very exciting. Would you say that the first book, the book we just covered here, when we continue to dive into, is that a prerequisite in any way to the new book you're working on?
I think in some ways it is. I mean, although we do kind of cover some of the same material, it really isn't going to teach you how to use Visual COBOL. So we've got a kind of hello world at the beginning, and there's a slightly larger chapter on procedural COBOL than there was in the first book, because I say a lot of the target audience for this will be possibly Java developers, but it's really not going to cover, it's not going to make you a COBOL programmer, it's not going to make you a Visual COBOL programmer. So if you haven't got familiarity with that stuff, then the first book probably is a prerequisite.
Understood. Thank you. Well, Scott, this is very exciting. I mean, can you share it with the audience here? When will this new book be available?
Oh, I'm not sure we can commit to anything. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's going to be a great new addition to what Paul's already written. So really looking forward to seeing that hit the shelves. Timeframes, well, it's always as soon as we possibly can, but we'll see how we get on, how Paul gets on. But to kind of whet people's appetite and to kind of coincide with the next major release of our Visual COBOL product, which is due out very soon, we will do our very best to make a couple of chapters of this book available so people can see what it's about and get a sense of what's coming in the future. So look out for information from Microfocus about the future webinars and launch webinars around Visual COBOL. Join those, and we'll give you information on how to find a couple of chapters as well that you can read and peruse and get a sense of what's coming later.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, we'll definitely have to stay tuned for some news around that new book and the next release of Visual COBOL. So, Scott and Paul, thank you very much for a few moments here to dive a bit deeper into behind the scenes with this book. Just for our audience, in terms of resources, where can you get a copy of the book today? It's very simple. Jump up to microfocus.com/book. You can download your free copy, electronic copy of the book today. And as Paul has mentioned, the samples are available as well online. Here's the direct link to the samples. This is also included within the book, as well as links to access the free software that Scott spoke about, the personal edition software. So that's available as part of the book as well. The instructions on how to do that are included within the book. For those that are interested in perhaps a hard copy, if you want a hard copy to have around the office, you can find that on Amazon.com. I also encourage you to take a closer look at some of the reviews that are up there as well from developers just like yourself. So we'd encourage to hear your feedback and certainly write a review if you do happen to read the book and share it with your team, or if you just have general feedback as well or a question for Paul or Scott, feel free to share that on our community forum. That's a free site that we have here at Microfocus, community.microfocus.com. It's a great way to get plugged into our support resources, our product management, our development teams, and of course there'll be a variety of forums there with focus on the book. So a great way to get instant access to some of the experts. So again, thank you very much for spending a few moments with us here today to take a closer look at modern COBOL development and this new book. Many of you did pre-submit questions, so we're going to take some time now to go through the questions you have pre-submitted, and certainly as time allows, try to take a few live questions on our queue as well. So Scott and Paul, I hope you're ready. Here is the first pre-submitted question. It's around prerequisite skills, and you touched on this a little bit, Paul. I mean, are there any prerequisite skills, I guess, regardless of whether you're a COBOL or a .NET or Java developer, in terms of picking up the book? What do we recommend here? Paul?
Hi, Paul. I don't know if we lost Paul or maybe he's on mute.
Oh, I'm still here, but there's a little mute button on my headset and I pressed it. So I'll say all that again. In terms of prerequisite skills, as I was saying when nobody could hear me, you do need to have some development experience already. The book isn't going to make you a programmer or a developer. It would help if you have some grounding with object orientation and the basic principles, because again, although we do touch on some of that stuff, we're not going to do a sort of deep dive that will make you into a kind of object oriented developer if you don't already know those things. We try to take it fairly gently, and I think as long as you have some COBOL background or some Java or .NET background, you should really be able to follow along with the examples and follow along with the book, because we try to keep the barrier to entry as low as we could.
It's very good. Thank you, Paul. Here's another question here, a little bit more focus around .NET and Java. I think the perspective is, isn't .NET and Java inherently OO platform technology, and effectively, how does this relate to procedural COBOL? Scott, maybe do you want to start with that one?
Certainly delighted to. Yes, good question. Absolutely, they are object-oriented environments by default. Java is an object-oriented language, and C# and Visual Basic and others are object-oriented languages, and the building blocks, the intermediate languages themselves, is object-oriented. If you look at the semantics, COBOL is also object-oriented. Actually, by looking through this book, you'll see the language extensions that enable you to write object-oriented code in COBOL as well. Very streamlined syntax. And very, very usable in these contexts. But a lot of the magic that goes on in that compiler, if I can put it that way, is really focused on customers with existing procedural COBOL applications, of course, which is the overwhelming majority of COBOL today is procedural COBOL. And it's getting a procedural COBOL application to compile and run in a .NET platform or Java virtual machine, which is object-oriented. Well, that's really the magic of the compiler and what it's doing to make that possible. We don't really have time to go into all the details here, but the key thing to remember is just because you've got procedural COBOL doesn't mean you're excluded from this platform. Anything but. You can bring that in and continue to develop in a procedural way, should you wish to do so. You can also blend with some object-oriented aspects within procedural code, or you can go full on into object-oriented development in COBOL as well. So all of those options exist, and it's all based on the capabilities of the Visual COBOL compiler.
And in fact, in the book, we do actually, if you like, pull the covers back a little on some of the magic that Scott referred to in terms of how the compiler enables your procedural program to run inside those environments, and also how you can actually, there are extensions to the runtime that have been put in, something called run units, that then allows you to take that, procedural program and actually call it from a web server, which is inherently a concurrent threaded environment. So there's a lot of work that's been done to make all this stuff work seamlessly and almost effortlessly. And that's what you get from using Visual COBOL.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Scott. Follow-on question here around, I think, COBOL deployment to the cloud. So maybe going back to the platform conversation we had previously. I mean, does the book cover that in any detail? What would we recommend there?
I'm afraid this book doesn't cover that in any detail. There may be something about that in the new book. I think the answer there is that there are many different ways you could deploy COBOL to the cloud, and we're still kind of figuring out what some of the best ones might be. And it's something really where I think I assume Scott would agree with me, where it would be good to have a conversation with some of our customers who want to do this, so we can sort of advise what the best way forward would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think get in touch. The question is covers a range of different deployments. So certainly many organizations are already deploying into Azure or AWS and other clouds today. And if you want to find out more about it, then what I would encourage you to do is get in contact with your account manager so that you can talk to technical people in Microfocus that can give you some more guidance there. Or alternatively, post your question to the community site, and you can see what information is available there. Additionally, there actually is a sample in Visual COBOL that shows you how to deploy into Azure, one kind of deployment. But probably also it's worth saying that a lot of the stuff that Paul is going to covers in the book, these are all things that you would actually quite potentially end up using in Azure or AWS anyway. So to some degree, it's going to be useful skills to have when you start thinking about the cloud, especially if you're going to be deploying in a .NET or a JVM environment.
Scott, thank you. I'm going to combine a few questions here because I see some similar themes around interfaces and UIs, particularly for COBOL. It refers to, this particular question refers to removing perhaps the negative stigma that users may have with COBOL based on character-based screens, and particularly screens that where COBOL is deployed on a Unix or Linux platform. Do we have any recommendations here, particularly for those that want to learn new ways in which they can improve that user interface? And let's start with Linux and Unix, and then of course there's some questions on the Windows side. So
Well,
Scott, do you want to start with that?
Yes, well, I think the interesting thing I want to draw on there is that kind of statement in the question. I know you've merged a few together here, Ed, but I can see one that's talking about the fact that the existing COBOL program is a green screen, 25 by 80 columns, and that look and feel of the application is kind of which looks dated, and absolutely we would agree with this, and out of touch with modern user interfaces, but it's actually kind of tainting all of the rest of the application, and people are seeing the entire application as being out of date when actually it's the front end that needs modernizing. The rest of the application could well be in very good shape, in the sense that it does a good job. It provides useful functionality to its users. The functionality you want to throw away and have to rewrite that again. You just want to change the user interface. So there's a wide variety of ways you can do that that we've been touching on today. But it's about disconnecting that existing UI and putting something on the front end. So lots of architecture. So Paul, why don't I throw the other half of the answer over to you about what sort of architectures that you might consider?
So with my kind of other background, which is working in web, I'm going to say throw away your green screen. Use some of the techniques that we've been talking about, recompile your application for JVM and get it up running on a, inside an application server, something like Tomcat. It's probably the easiest one to get started with. And what you want to do is you'd have a small kind of Java shim almost that provides a set of REST services. And you can use something like the Spring Framework to do that, or Jack's Jersey. I'm sorry, I could acronym you to death, but I'll try not to. But effectively, you use Java to provide a set of REST services that call your COBOL backend. And then on the front end, you can use, you literally use just JavaScript and a web browser. And you can produce very slick looking user interfaces that way. You can use JavaScript frameworks like Angular and come away with a very modern looking application indeed. So that would be kind of one way. Certainly if your platform is Linux, Unix, that is really the easiest way to go, because everybody has a web browser, not only on their computer, but also on their phone. So if you go down that route, you have something that you can potentially extend out to all kinds of new places.
That's great, Paul. That's great, Scott. Thank you. Great insights there for those on Unix and Linux platforms. Are the recommendations similar on the Windows side? I mean, do you have a preference on whether WinForms or WPF technology is used with modern COBOL?
Yeah, let me jump in there, because that's a question that actually comes up quite a lot, actually, for customers that are looking to modernize the user interface. Specifically, that's the main need. There's all sorts of other modernization concerns that might present themselves, but UI is one. And if they're on a Windows platform, there's some choices to be made about which technology, and often for a thick client running on the desktop, WinForms or WPF comes out often as one of two that they might choose. And we're asked which one should we go for? And what I would usually advise is that WinForms is a technology, Microsoft's first sort of .NET UI technology, and is still supported by Microsoft and is widely used, but actually is a user interface. I don't believe it's been greatly extended beyond its current capabilities. WPF, on the other hand, is much more recent user interface technology that Microsoft have provided, and is under further development. I would say is perhaps considered more modern. So In addition to that, however, I would say that nevertheless, WinForms, which might provide all the functionality that you need and be a world away, in fact, from what the user interface of the application looks like today, actually that's a place that many start with, because WinForms is actually a very straightforward technology to get to grips with quickly. So I see a lot of organizations choosing that. But my general advice, just beyond which UI you might choose, the one thing that you always want to be aiming for is a way of encapsulating your business logic so that there's a good separation of that between the user interface and the back-end code, which I think is a lesson that everyone is aware of. Over years of development of an application, you might find that today that's very intermingled, and business logic and UI is very intermingled, but usually there are points in the application, just entry points, which can be called with function codes and perform a certain operation and return a result as a result from that. That's the kind of direction you want to get to, so that you've got reusable functions that can be called regardless of the user interface. Because that front end does change periodically, and when it's time to move to a new one, or you want to make your application accessible via a REST service, for example, then the code is pretty much in a format in an architecture that is very compatible with a new user interface or another way of invoking it. So that's really the thing to keep in mind, I would say.
Scott, thank you very much. That's great. Just going back to the topic that was discussed just a moment ago, Paul, when you talked a little about integration capability, particularly on the Java and open source side, very similar question here with these folks that have effectively separated their COBOL code from the .NET presentation layer and looking for better ways to integrate them. I mean, do we make any particular suggestions there in terms of how those invocations happen? I mean, there's one model better than the next, or what do we suggest?
Well, I guess, I mean, the first thing is, not knowing any of the details of their application, what they've done. The first thing is simply make sure you're compiling your Visual COBOL, your COBOL code to .NET, so that the .NET code can call the COBOL code directly without needing to go through platform invoke or marshalling. So that's the first step. Then if you've already done that, it's kind of hard to give recommendations really without knowing a little bit more about the application. But certainly one of the big things I've seen with COBOL applications is that traditionally they tend to be written in a way where they show you something and wait for something to happen, whereas obviously modern applications are written more in terms of a user interface that is running all the time and asks when it wants something. So there's usually some work to do to kind of move your COBOL code from that kind of thing where it's in charge, presenting screens and waiting for results, and turning it into something that's more event driven.
That makes sense. Thank you, Paul. Maybe one more question here. I know we're at the top of the hour, but maybe one more question. It talks a little bit about, inquires about more examples, Paul, or samples, particularly for calling .NET libraries from native COBOL code. What would you suggest there?
Right, we were discussing this briefly before the call, and in fact, .NET, the CLR, makes it very easy to call native code from managed code. It is not so easy going in the other direction. And in fact, the main methods Microsoft provides you to do that, you can do that through COM. So you can use COM to call from native code to .NET libraries, but there's a bit of work to be done there to do that. And then the only other way admittedly, I haven't looked at this for some time, so my knowledge isn't completely up to date, but the only other easy way I've found to call .NET libraries from native code is actually using Microsoft's C++ CLI. So that's their sort of managed C++. And you can actually create a library there that has a series of entry points that you can call from native code, but which can then call out to managed code. I don't know if there are any other easy ways to do it, but as I say, it's I'd need to do a bit of research to make sure.
I suppose, Paul, that's all it's made particularly difficult if you're trying to do it in process, or at least we're not sure of all the techniques. But if it's out of process invocation, there's probably other ways you can do this. Actually, a lot more standard. So some sort of story service type invocation.
Or you could use something like I think Microsoft have a message queuing service, MSMQ. And there's ActiveMQ as well, which is another way of doing out of process calls. So ActiveMQ, although it's a Java application, the message broker is Java, I think they have connectors that work with just about everything. And certainly I know they have native connectors, because you can connect C to ActiveMQ. So if you can connect C to ActiveMQ, you can connect COBOL to it as well. So that's another way of doing an out of process call.
Very good. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Scott. We're past our time here. We want to be respectful of folks moving to next meetings and so forth. There's a variety of questions, so thank you very much, folks, for submitting those. What we'll do is we will compile a set of answers for you for the questions we couldn't get to, and certainly for those that have submitted a question here in the queue. And we'll post those on our community forum on community.microfocus.com. We'll make that available to you within the coming days, and certainly this webinar as well will be recorded and made available to all those that have registered for this broadcast within the coming week. So you'll have an opportunity to replay that and, of course, share it with your colleagues. Before I wrap up, Scott or Paul, do you have any closing words for the group that's joined us today?
Well, I'll go first then, in which case I think that resource about the community site, Ed, is a really good one for me to close on. We couldn't answer all the questions. There's perhaps more detail we need to answer some of these, so I would really encourage you to visit the community site, check out what's going on there, post your own questions. There's a lot more people who are able to answer, and you can provide more detail. So that's a particularly good resource. Paul, how about you? Anything to say?
Not a great deal really, apart from thank you all for taking the time to come and listen. Do read the book, because we'd like to get more reviews and find out if we're doing the right thing with it. Hopefully before I finish writing another one. Be nice to know if we're going in the right direction with all this. So we welcome your comments.
And Indeed. Of course it's free.
And of course it's free. Yes.
Yes. Great reasons to take advantage of this opportunity. So Paul and Scott, thank you very much for spending a few moments with us, sharing your insights and behind the scenes with this new developer resource. For those that have joined us here today, again, thank you for spending your time with us. And please take advantage of that opportunity. Register for your free copy of the book. It's available on the URL that you see on this screen. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you have questions, please reach out to us. As Paul said, it's a great way to influence new material that we're releasing to support modern COBOL development. And of course, as you heard, many of those resources are coming a bit later this year. So again, thank you very much for spending your day with us, and have a great day.